Arlis Perry, born Arlis Dykema, had lived in Palo Alto, California for a short period of time when she was murdered in 1974. Earlier that year, she had married her high school sweetheart, Bruce Perry, who was attending Stanford University. Before his sophomore year, the two had married, and Arliss joined him in the Golden State, which was a far cry from her hometown of Bismarck, North Dakota. Arliss, who was very religious, struggled to adapt to her new environment. She began working for a Palo Alto law firm, but struggled to make new friends, and she ended up spending a lot of her free time at a church nearby the dormitory she lived at with her husband, Bruce. The church was the Stanford Memorial Church, an epic, grand-looking cathedral that was just a short walk away from their dorm. Arliss had lived on the Stanford University campus for only 8 weeks, when on the night of October 12, 1974, her and her husband, Bruce, got into an argument. After arguing for a short period of time, she set off for the nearby Memorial Church at around 11 p.m. Hours began to pass, and Arliss did not return home. Bruce, who had been studying and napping on and off throughout the evening, called police at a little after 3 a.m., but Arliss would not be found for a couple of hours after that. At around 5:40 in the morning, the security guard that had closed up the Stanford Memorial Church, named Stephen Crawford, allegedly discovered a side door of the church which had been forced open from the inside. He later told investigators that he looked into the strange sighting, which led him to discover the gruesome scene inside the Memorial Church. Arliss Perry had been brutally murdered, her body laid out in a grotesque, demeaning manner. Early reports would indicate that there was some kind of occult relationship to the crime, while others noted that it had been the work of a violent, opportunistic sexual offender. Investigators theorized that Arliss Perry had been killed with an ice pick, having been stabbed in the back of the head. They were able to lift a palm print from a church candle, as well as semen from a nearby church kneeler, but neither led them to the killer. After all, forensic testing in the mid-1970s was very primitive. Both Arliss's husband, Bruce, as well as the security guard, Stephen Crawford, were suspected. Bruce was eventually cleared of any wrongdoing, but Stephen Crawford remained linked to the case. However, police admitted that they had very little evidence against Crawford, especially when the preliminary forensic testing seemed to rule against him. As 1974 came to a close, the case began to grow cold. Rumors began to allege that Arliss had been involved in some religious feuding, and a North Dakota cult had followed her from her hometown to commit this heinous murder. Years later, the son of Sam himself, David Berkowitz, hinted at some involvement. When the Satanic Panic craze of the 1980s kicked off, everyone was trying to find related cases to link to this high-profile murder, but none seemed to fit. That's because the answer was much simpler than anyone expected. And now, years later, investigators believe that they have solved the tragic murder of Arliss Perry. Stephen Blake Crawford, who often went by his nickname of Steve, was a veteran of the United States Air Force. In 1971, Crawford began working for the Stanford Department of Public Safety as a police officer who carried a firearm. A year later, though, a new police chief began to completely revamp and reorganize the department, forcing many of his officers to reapply for their positions, as well as their firearm qualifications. Over 75% of the officers were then forced out of their current positions, and as compensation, were then offered jobs as security guards. Stephen Crawford was one of those officers. He became a security guard for the Stanford Department of Public Safety, eventually landing a position that put him in the background of the lives of Arliss and Bruce Perry. When Arliss stormed off to the Stanford Memorial Church to clear her head, it was Steve Crawford who locked up the church, and eventually discovered Arliss's body the following morning. 2 years after the terrible murder at the Memorial Church, Steve Crawford left the staff of Stanford. However, he had seemed to hold a grudge against the school, and would be later linked to the university forever. In my original episode, I mentioned that Stephen Crawford fell into some legal trouble in 1992, years after leaving the staff. He was arrested and charged with stealing several items from Stanford collections, including Western-style bronze statues and books, items which were numbering in the hundreds. He had been stealing from the multiple buildings he had access to, as well as from the offices of faculty and staff members themselves. This event was just a random thing that I discovered during my research for the original episode, which came out over 2 years ago, but I found it odd. If he had been committing these petty crimes for years without getting caught, what else had he gotten away with? To their credit, Santa Clara investigators also found it odd. They had never dropped Steve Crawford from their list of suspects, but they had never obtained enough evidence against him. They had struggled to make a case in favor of his guilt due to the rudimentary means of forensic testing available in the 1970s. Sheriff Lori Smith, who began working for the Santa Clara Sheriff's Office shortly before the murder of Arliss Perry, has long been obsessed with the case. In the years since, she has worked her way to the position of sheriff itself, and she has mentioned that Crawford was always at the top of their list of suspects. Quote, "Nothing ever cleared him. There was just not enough evidence to charge him with a crime." Following his theft arrest in 1992, Crawford spent a short amount of time in jail and was back in the real world shortly thereafter. In 1993, he moved to San Jose, California, in an area just off of Highway 85 at the 5200 block of Camden Avenue. He moved into the first floor of the Del Coronado apartment complex, where he had lived in apartment 185 ever since. Neighbors and tenants say that Crawford, who often wore a cowboy hat and walked with the assistance of a cane, was quiet and kept to himself. His landlord says that Crawford had not worked in some time and lived off of either Social Security or retirement. In recent years, DNA testing has progressed significantly, and recently investigators began revamping their investigation into the murder of Arliss Perry. They began experimenting with new testing methods, which would allow them to turn evidence found at the scene over 40 years ago into modern-day results. Matt Breaker, a prosecutor in the Santa Clara County District Attorney's Office, stated, quote, "This case has been looked at for years by members of the Sheriff's Office and the DA's office. Multiple heads of our cold case unit advanced the case." Due to these advancements in testing methods and procedures, investigators were growing much more confident that they could bring this case to a close. As such, they began reviewing old components of their case, and that led them straight back to security guard Stephen Crawford, the man who had discovered the body of Arliss Perry and had presumably been one of the last people to see her alive. Over the last couple of months, Crawford was brought in for a series of interviews, over 4 decades after the crime took place, and just within the last week, the DNA evidence became conclusive enough to obtain a search warrant of Crawford's San Jose apartment. On the morning of Thursday, June 28th, 2018, Santa Clara Sheriff's deputies and San Jose police officers knocked on the apartment door of Stephen Crawford. They announced their presence at around 9:05 a.m., and from there, things did not go quite as planned. A statement from the San Jose Police Department reads, quote, "During the execution of the search warrant, sheriff's deputies made verbal contact at a closed front door with an occupant in the apartment. As deputies made entry, they observed an adult male with a handgun, and the deputies immediately backed away. A short time later, a gunshot was heard. No deputies discharged their weapons. Deputies eventually entered the residence and discovered an adult male with an apparent self-inflicted gunshot wound. The male was pronounced deceased at the scene. No one else was present or injured." Stephen Crawford, who had become aware of law enforcement's increasing interest in him as a suspect, decided to take the coward's way out, instead of finally facing some responsibility for his actions. Later in the day, a press conference was announced. Santa Clara County Sheriff Lori Smith spoke and announced their findings.
Good afternoon, and thank you for being patient with us from this morning. A little bit of background on the case. In 1974, there was a callous and cold-hearted murder of an exceptional young woman. Her name was Arliss Perry, and my heart goes out to the family and the community as a whole. A mother and father lost a daughter, a husband lost a wife. Our detectives have worked diligently over the years to solve the murder of Arliss. It comes with great honor to announce we solved the 43-year-old cold case. Stephen Blake Crawford, 72-year-old, was a security guard at Stanford University at the time of the murder. Crawford had been a person of interest since the beginning of the investigation. Our detectives continued to piece together additional information to this tragic puzzle, and we were able recently to link Crawford's DNA to the crime scene. Today, our detectives were serving a warrant, and when they knocked on the door of Crawford's residence, he killed himself. Our detectives are still at the scene searching the residence for additional evidence connecting Crawford to this murder and to any other unsolved murders. I cannot understate the efforts of our detectives. They've done an exceptional job. Many cold case homicide detectives have worked on this for years. We followed all the leads and unraveled the entanglement of the evidence associated with the murder of Arliss Perry. We truly have a talented group of detectives who provide exceptional services to the residents of Santa Clara County. This is a case that eludes us no longer. Lead Detective Sergeant Richard Alanis kept this picture of Arliss Perry with him as a constant reminder that her life and this case had value. I'd be happy to take any questions from the media.
How does it make you feel? I mean, this is more than 40 years after the fact, and you've been able to use DNA evidence to bring the killer to justice. This
case was really personal to me. She was murdered just soon after I started the sheriff's office, and it was high profile at the time. It's been frustrating throughout the years that we could never get enough evidence to charge the suspect. It's difficult for her family, it's difficult for the department, but we finally have closure on this case.
How were you able to get Crawford's DNA?
The detectives had continually gone through the evidence, submitted additional evidence for testing. There was no DNA at the time of the murder, of course, but then there have been enhancements in their capabilities, so we just continued to submit the evidence to the crime lab, and it came from, I think, an item of her clothing.
So what were they after going to the apartment today? What was the search warrant for? How did that come about?
Obviously, you need a lot of probable cause for a search warrant, which they had based on information that we had in the past. But today they were executing the search warrant to see if they could find additional anything that would link him to the crime. And we'll get the press together again tomorrow because I think our detectives are still searching his residence. The search was postponed because he killed himself, so the suicide had to be investigated while still preserving his scene, still preserving his apartment, so then we could go in and finish executing the search warrant.
And can you explain what initially cleared him 44 years ago?
Nothing ever cleared him. There was just not enough evidence to charge him with the crime. Anything else?
Are there any other pieces of substantial evidence that you guys have come across in his apartment that may link him?
They're still doing the search. I think they're still doing it right now. They were when I talked earlier. And so we don't know the information on that, but we will get back to you if we do find anything additional. He knew he was a person of interest. He knew that we were continuing the investigation actively right now because our detective have talked to him recently. So I'm not sure if this was not unexpected for us to show up at his door.
Could you describe maybe some of those conversations that you guys had previously?
Just interrogations and trying to get additional information, elicit additional evidence. He didn't provide us anything concrete with enough to arrest at that time, but then we continued and were able to then get the search warrant.
Did the contact with him ramp up recently, or was this steady over the last however long?
It's been on and off throughout the years. We generally would have had a need to talk with him. Ramped up recently, absolutely.
Is there any connection between the known connection between the suspect and Arliss?
No, none at all. You know that she was murdered in the church at Stanford, and he was a security guard. I don't think we have any evidence at this time that they knew each other at Stanford, but they were both associated with Stanford. And so tomorrow we will have a lot more information. We'll be able to debrief with the detectives and see if they were able to find any additional information. And we'll follow up with you on that. So thank you very much for taking the time. Yes, ma'am.
Is there any other connection to them with any other violent crimes at Stanford?
Not that we're aware of now, but we're continuing to follow up. But no, we don't have any reason to believe that now.
I assume you did DNA testing prior. Were there any types of tests that emerged that you were able to connect them?
There was evidence to the crime lab. They'd done DNA testing in the past, but we weren't able to get anything until recently.
Sure. Have you talked to the Perry family or anyone connected with them? If so, what have they expressed?
So we have reached out. Our detectives have talked with family members. They were appreciative of the notification, and that's about all the information I have, but we have reached out. So
Thank you very much, folks.
thank you.
Stanford University released a statement of their own to the press, which read, quote, "We extend our gratitude to local law enforcement for their efforts over decades to try to resolve this disturbing case. It remains a heart-wrenching memory at the university. Stanford has been cooperating with investigators over many years, and we know they've been working tirelessly to try to bring this case to a conclusion." In my original episode about Arliss Perry, which came out over 2 years ago, I tried to detail the many moving parts and characters from Arliss's final days. One of those was Stephen Crawford, who I then viewed as a sympathetic figure who stumbled upon events beyond his control. I now regret doing so, and feel naive for not viewing him more critically. Police are continuing to put together their case against Stephen Crawford, and will undoubtedly have much more information to release as their case comes to a conclusion. At this point, they feel confident that Stephen Crawford is the culprit of this terrible crime, and his suicide only cements what investigators believe is a guilty conscience. They are also exploring other potential crimes that Crawford may have committed over the years, and will release those details in due time if they find anything. Bruce Perry, the once widower husband of Arliss, has since remarried and had children and grandchildren of his own. He lives in Texas, where he has become a noted author and expert of childhood trauma. After almost every school shooting, his expertise is called upon, and he has become a constant presence on national news every few months. The family of Arliss Perry are hoping that this news will bring about resolution for their daughter and sister, whose case has been unsolved for almost 44 years. Her parents, Marvin and Jean, continued to live in North Dakota, and have eagerly awaited any news from investigators. Tragically though, Jean Dykema, Arliss's mother, said in an interview just yesterday, quote, "It's been horrible, and my husband wanted to know so badly, and he died 3 months ago." Arliss's father, Marvin Dykema, had been waiting for over 4 decades to find out who had killed his little girl, and he happened to pass away just 3 months before the likely answer was revealed. According to the strong religious faith of the Dykema family, however, he is now celebrating in the afterlife with his daughter, who has finally received some much-needed closure. As for Stephen Crawford, the alleged perpetrator of this crime, well, Arliss's mother, Jean Dykema, has some thoughts about him as well. Quote, "I know there is someone far greater that will punish this person. I don't have to do that." As of this episode's recording, it seems like the story of Arliss Perry might actually be resolved.